All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's American Ambulance Association webinar on mandatory vaccines and accommodation requests. Today's webinar is presented by AAA consultants Scott Moore and Ben Jensen of Bell Ambulance in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you guys for joining us today. As always, our webinar is going to be recorded and it will be going out in tomorrow morning's Daily Digest. In addition, it'll be posted on the AAA's website in the store under on-demand webinars. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Scott to get us started.
Well, thank you, Meg. I want to thank all of you for joining us for, I feel like we've spent a fair amount of time talking about vaccinations over the last few months, but for good reason. Certainly, we have never had anything that even remotely resembles what's happened over the last 18 to 20 months. So I do know that it takes a lot of time out of your schedule to join us for a program like this. And I know that everybody is dealing with what are relatively unprecedented workforce shortages as well. So I want to thank you for taking the time to watch the program and for supporting the association. I also want to thank my co-presenter, Ben Jensen. Ben is the Director of HR and IT for longtime AAA member, Bell Ambulance. As many of you know, Bell is a very active member in not only the AAA, but the Wisconsin Ambulance Association and, or I'm sorry, it's PAW, no, Wisconsin Ambulance Provider. No, I know I'm going to mess. Professional Ambulance Providers of Wisconsin, PAW, right? Yeah, that's what it is. So in any event, Ben, thank you so much for agreeing to do this webinar. I think I want to make sure people didn't just hear from me and that they got to hear from someone who actually still does the job day to day. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet, Scott. Pleasure to be aboard.
All right. So what we're going to attempt to do over the next hour, hopefully, and we'll go as long or as short as sort of the questions dictate, is to tackle, talk a little bit about the mandatory vaccination issue for COVID-19. Now, as I always do before we start a program, is just a quick reminder and disclaimer. I'm not giving legal advice today. This is really in a program that's intended for educational or informational purposes only. If you need legal advice, you should consult a licensed attorney in your area. So I think I've done 3 or 4 quick takes tied to vaccinations. I know we did another webinar earlier this year on vaccinations as the vaccine became available. And as everyone knows, of course, what we had hoped was in our rearview mirror has sort of come back with a vengeance. This past August, OSHA's been very, very active on the workforce front as it relates to trying to protect workers and passing regulations. And in this, also we know early on, earlier this summer, they passed the emergency temporary standard relative to workplaces where either some or not all of your workforce happens to be vaccinated. Most recently releasing on the 13th, this guidance that really was a recommendation that said, look, regardless of vaccination status, you probably should have everybody masked in your workplace. And I know that masking is a hot button issue for a lot of folks. And that includes EMS folks who are aware of sort of the science behind why masking works. And a lot of people are super ready to be done with masking. And, and in my times of traveling, being on airplanes, it's not really that bad. But if you've got to do any kind of physical activity, I could not imagine doing an extrication from a 2nd or 3rd story during a cardiac arrest with a mask on. I remember wholly sweating yourself through your shirt when, when in August, when you're doing a cardiac arrest. I cannot imagine what that's like now, having to wear masks. So just thought I would do a little timeline from the beginning of August. So back, when we did it, when I did one of our, I think it was our 2nd vaccination quick take, back on August 4th, roughly 165 million Americans were fully vaccinated. Another 192 had at least one shot. Roughly 9 days later, 167, and then 196, at least one shot. So as of yesterday, and you'll notice the colors are a little bit different between these maps back on the 4th and the 13th. And that's just because thankfully those vaccination numbers are starting to come up. But as you can still see, 173 million are fully vaccinated, roughly 52% of the folks in this country. 204 million have one shot, and nearly 1 million have a third dose since August 13th. So as we can see, those higher vaccination locations are really up here in New England, where I am, in particular, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Vermont. Now, as you look at the infections rates, as we're talking about Delta, the Delta variant, and bummer for anybody who has a business name Delta. Certainly, I'm sure. I wonder what that's done for social media. Ben, I know, sorry. You can only take me so far, right? And then you're like, who invited this guy? So back on August 4th, as you could see, the infection rates, and this was the transmission rate of COVID and the Delta variant around the United States. And as you can see, there was a correlation really up in the Northeast. The numbers were really relatively very low. On August 13th, of course, it really pretty much completely covered the entire country. And as of yesterday, there's one lone holdout state of Vermont that still is in the substantial, but really everywhere else in the country has now gone to a red status, which is a high transmissibility or transmission rate for COVID-19. And as I told my co-presenters and the AAA staff just before this program, it turned out the gentleman that I share an office with in the next room just tested positive today. So fingers crossed, I am vaccinated. So we'll be quarantining for the next couple of days, probably week or so. As we take a look here at the total doses administered, as I said, one of the things that we'd see, and it's really hard to tell now, but when you went back a couple of slides, what you could see as you started to look at the vaccination rates in comparison to the infection rates, you could see really those high levels of transmission were really more in the southern states, and really over time just started to take over the entire country. So we're still seeing very high levels of infection around the country, as well as nearly 636,000, just over 636,000 people have died as a result of COVID-19. I know one of my old ambulance partners passed away, a gentleman who played piano at my wedding, but who I worked on the ambulance with for several years, many years, passed away early on in the pandemic, and several neighbors. So I don't think there's anybody nowadays who probably hasn't been touched by some way, shape, or form by this pandemic. And so there's no, this has been one of the, I think, difficult things, and it would be interesting to see is, had this pandemic not occurred at the same time as the election, I would be interested to see what would have happened from the media and the way that this pandemic was handled. That's not a political discussion. It's just become a very politicized issue. And I'm not, sort of making light of any part of that, just to say what would have been wonderful is if the politics didn't get wound up into it. We could have stayed more with just allowing the healthcare folks and the CDC and the government regulators to be able to sort of deal with what really is the healthcare related effects of this, rather than some of the socioeconomic political impacts that we've seen. But as we know, we're seeing more and more employers, more and more entities around the country start to mandate vaccinations. We do know that President Biden had expanded a vaccine mandate push, in fact, instructing CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicaid Services, to release regulations relative to requiring that all employees of long-term care facilities become vaccinated. And so what we don't know quite yet is exactly what those regulations will look like. So CMS will likely release those in the next week or so, I would imagine, because if there will be a notice and comment period, they're going to need to make sure that those regulations get out. And what folks like me and Ben, folks who do HR, are interested in is how exactly will CMS address what will likely be those people who can't get vaccinated because of either a medical condition or because of a sincerely held religious belief. But what we do know are the courts are holding up those mandatory vaccinations. The court in Texas, of course, did hear a case and upheld the termination of 150 employees who responding to the mandatory vaccination requirement either quit or were terminated because they failed to get vaccinated, and the court did uphold that. Massachusetts did. The governor passed or is now mandating that all long-term care facility staff, in fact, he came out before the president did, but now, of course, the sort of point is moot because CMS will be releasing those regulations. And the question that we're getting asked pretty frequently is, well, if it's being required for any long-term care facility that bills Medicare, for services, will that also extend to EMS providers? And we just don't know the answer to that. I think it goes to sort of the logic would carry that if they're going to require a long-term care facility, folks, I think because that's communal living, there's high transmission rates in those facilities. The question will be is, will it also be required for hospitals and EMS? I think there's probably a strong likelihood that that will be the case. So just as we start to, the way we're going to sort of roll the program is we're going to talk a little bit about can an employer, and I think everybody knows the answer to this, obviously the big button at the bottom of the slide that says, yes, you can. Can you mandate vaccinations? You most certainly can. Of course, there are two specific issues related to when possibly someone might not have to get vaccinated. You can do it because arguably it would be job related and consistent with business necessity. So, however, there are two instances in which an employee might not have to get vaccinated. One would be if that employee had a medical condition for which would qualify as a disability under the ADA, or if that person had a sincerely held religious belief for which becoming vaccinated would sort of offend that sincerely held religious belief. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, one of the big questions is, well, geez, what if we mandate vaccinations and as a result we end up losing a fair number of our staff? And of course, that is a real big concern because a whole bunch of folks in fact, I do not know an EMS agency in the country that is not dealing with workforce shortage right now. In fact, we don't know any employer really in the country not dealing with workforce shortages. So the concern is, well, what if they leave? And then the other question is are we really going to terminate our employees who refuse to get vaccinated? Now, and I'm saying refuse, meaning not because of a sincerely held religious belief or a medical condition, just people who, for whatever their philosophy is, I don't agree with this vaccination, or they've heard information that for whatever reason has turned them off of it. For some folks, it is strictly political, and we understand it. And I think the answer to that is no. Of course, what I will say is, going back to that Bridges case in Texas that upheld that termination of those 150 employees, I think that I understand, I want to get past the political piece and we'll talk a little bit about it, but just want to recognize, I don't think anybody in EMS is in a position to terminate staff because frankly, it comes down to one, they're concerned about being able to staff the units, but two, really concerned about being able to deliver service. But the big reason why many are doing this are because their contracted partners, the hospitals, the nursing homes, the groups that they service, have instituted a mandatory vaccination policy for not only their own staff, but also for the staff of any vendor or contractor that they work with. That has been really one of the driving forces for a lot. In fact, we've seen a lot of folks who have not mandated it, but once their contracted partner said that they had to do it, that really started that process. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about, and I'm going to bring Ben in on this one, is, what are some of those factors that you need to consider as your organization is considering whether to do or whether to institute a mandatory vaccination program? So Ben, can I ask you, as the team at Bell, you guys have a very strong management team, long time, you've all been working together. What were some of those considerations that you guys had, both good and bad, for instituting a mandatory vaccination program?
Right. So we talked about it, as you can imagine, as most companies are, at great length about whether we were going to mandate the vaccine or not. And, at the end of the day, it kind of went down two different paths that we ended up mandating the vaccine. First and foremost, we have to provide a safe work environment to our workforce. And we believe that, and I think this is going to be the motto of, people getting vaccine and getting mandated, is doing the right thing, right? Right thing for the health and safety of our workforce, our clients, and the communities that we serve. Second piece of it, Scott, you already kind of alluded to it. Several of the bigger healthcare companies in our operating area did go to a mandated vaccine, and not just for their employees, but for their volunteers, their vendors, and their contractors. So that means us. So at that point, our hands were more or less forced, and we implemented the mandatory vaccine. One of the other steps we did with that vaccine, the policy for the vaccine, is we tied it to the timeline of some of the bigger healthcare companies in the area. And we picked the earliest date of those so that we are compliant when their policy goes into place. So that's kind of what drew us there. The downfalls, you kind of already talked about it a little bit. Yep, we're very worried about some of the staff who are electing not to get the vaccine, whether it's through a sincerely held religious belief, or you kind of alluded to it as well, the political side, right? At the end of the day, do we want to terminate anybody? No, we want to come to that middle ground and figure out how do we move forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think, and I am familiar with some of the process occurring as you guys went through that. We had consulted, but I know one of the things that we recognize is that you really don't have a lot of control over those contracted partners if they are mandating it for both their own staff and for any vendor or contracted partner that's entering the building. Recognize that those healthcare partners are employers too, and under OSHA have that same obligation to provide a workplace that is free from known or unknown, from known hazards for certain, and any sort of, and try to prevent any preventable injury. And so, we recognize that they do have the right, and this is a question that's come up several times, is do they have the right to mandate that our employees get vaccinated? And the answer to that is, well, they have the right to demand that anybody who comes into their facility has been vaccinated. Now, one of the challenges that I know, or that we, and Ben and I, as we've worked through some of these with Bell, has been, what is that contracted partner's position on the exemption? And so, but I want to hit that, and we'll hit that again, I think, in a minute. But can I, one of the things that I talk about is, what we're learning, and I think what we've learned sort of going through some of these, and not just the folks at Bell, I've been working with others around the country on the same issue, is I said in my quick take, try and use logic and facts. In other words, remember that a lot of our folks are medical-based professionals. And so what I've sort of suggested for those who have concerns, whether they be legitimately because they have a medical condition or because of their religion, what often we're doing is not only you're never going to change somebody's political, right? To sort of say, don't ever talk about politics and religion, right? You're not going to change someone's political position, and you're not going to change someone's religious position. And frankly, you never really should. Now, but the fact of the matter is that you should be providing them with information that helps them, make a decision for themselves, because ultimately what we're looking to do is make sure that employees make the right decision for themselves. And if that decision is one that's consistent with the employer's policy and their goal, that's great. And if it is not, then certainly, of course, that's their choice. But what I've often said to people are, consult your healthcare professional, consult your religious leader, whether that be clergy, rabbi, whoever that religious leader is, and talk to them about your concerns and ask them for guidance and for information. Because oftentimes I know a lot of physicians are aware of the issues surrounding these these vaccinations and can provide a fair amount of decent background and information. Now, I have fallen victim to this just like others have, right? In other words, in looking through information, almost all of us use the web in some form or fashion to try and find information. And I have read through many of the FDA attachments related to different vaccinations, not just the COVID vaccination, but some of the other vaccinations like the flu vaccination, Hep B, Hep C, Hep A, polio, MMR. What I will say is you do need to make sure, like I said, I've fallen victim to this as well. In fact, read an FDA insert for a flu vaccine that while it said used certain cell lines, you have to recognize that sometimes you're looking for confirmation bias, right? That I tackled those documents looking for a particular thing that I wanted to find, and I found it when in fact, actually, I should have confirmed that source. So what I will say is ask the folks who you're talking with to furnish the information. If they're using or citing documentation, make sure that you're asking them to cite those sources, as well as be prepared when you're producing your information to be able to cite those sources and to be able to produce that information for folks. This is a learning process. Just so we're clear, Ben, how many pandemics have you dealt with in your career?
Just this one, and hopefully it'll be the last one.
Knock on wood, right? And that's what I'll say to folks is that in my whole career, 17 years as a lawyer and 31 years in EMS, 29 of those being in management, prior to this last year with COVID, I think I've addressed 4, maybe more, but not much more, 4 to 5 religious accommodation requests. And most of those have been tied around either schedule or making a seal with an N95, the clean shaven issue, because there are religions that do have very specific rules relative to facial hair. So what I would suggest is this is new territory for everybody. And by the way, if you end up with bad information, make sure you own it and move forward, because the goal is you want to preserve that relationship on the other side of this process. So understanding and education. So Ben, how did your folks, when you went to announce this policy, sort of what process did you guys take leading up to it? And then what process have you had, or what information have you distributed since?
So yeah, we've done a lot of things. One of the most important ones that I believe we did is we have virtual town halls with our employees. And we started that, probably a year and a half ago when we were in the thick of the pandemic. And just to kind of provide people an update of what it is going on in the business at that time, providing PPE and all the other things, because we couldn't see people face to face at that time. And so we kind of continued that trend as we went along. And so when we announced that we were moving to a mandatory vaccination, it came out in an email and a policy came out with it as well. And we immediately followed that up with a town hall where we had some really good conversations with folks who are on. And some of those trailed into the conversations that Scott and I are having now, which is excellent. That's what we want people to do, is to communicate with us. So the other things that we've done, we have several folks here who have really dug into the science of both the virus and the vaccination. And so it's great because those folks now can offer more of an intimate conversation. Not all employees are bold enough to step up in front of a public forum and speak their mind. So we have a couple folks here that offer that, you want to come in and talk about the vaccination, your concerns and issues. We're happy to do that and provide that education to them. In addition, along with the ETS that OSHA published, we have an education and training coordinator that sends out all information, whether it's on that, whether it's about the vaccine, all that stuff. So there's just you have to do a multitude of educational pieces for your employees, because not everybody in this day and age looks at email. Not everybody goes on, the virtual town hall. So we try as many different ways as possible to make sure that we're reaching out and touching every one of our employees.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, it's one of the things that you said that, or I was thinking as you were talking about this, was that also recognize that the role employers play now in the decision-making process for people and their whole family. And oftentimes, where we are an educational, I mean, where we are a medical group that tends to, if you're in a medical field, you've basically made the commitment to lifelong learning, right? Because medicine is constantly evolving. And so I think what we're finding also now is that some of these issues are in educating that whole family, because for all you know, if your 21, 22-year-old employee is against it, it may be because there's a familiar issue where the family has decided, or has said to their kids, we don't want you to do that. I think recognizing that you may not, one, there may be issues at hand that you're not aware of. For example, someone may be citing one objection despite the fact that maybe there is an underlying medical condition. But as I sort of have said before, is seek first to understand. When I had someone who said no, they weren't going to get it, and I found out then it was just that they tended to pass out when they got needles, so they were waiting for the J&J single shot, so they only passed out once, which I understood. I mean, I then made sense to me, but at first I presumed that this individual was just vaccination, which really prior to this past year, that was a very, very, very small subsection of the population. So, I think providing education, providing resources, that is probably the only real way you're going to change, have an effective impact on, on whether your folks are on board or not. And just so we know, we see some questions coming up in the queue. I did answer one, which I will repeat as we move a little further down. We're leaving a huge chunk of the program for member questions in a few minutes. That doesn't mean don't ask them now. We'd love you to continue to ask them. You can ask them either, we prefer that you do it in the Q&A, but if it has to be in the chat, that's perfectly fine. So just want to talk a little bit about what the law sort of says around mandatory vaccinations. Now, I know I already said that, Jess, the law does permit an organization to mandate vaccinations for their staff. And in fact, early on, there was a lot of question as to whether the emergency use authorization for these vaccinations were an issue. And there was pretty settled law that, in fact, it wasn't. But of course, now we know that at least one of those, the Pfizer vaccine, has been fully approved by the FDA. And so some of those concerns, I know PWW did a webinar that they hit on some very important topics, talking about things like the Nuremberg Code, essentially where a Nuremberg mandate, where there was this discussion about you can't force people to do medical experiments. I think that's a point we had thought about, but certainly I hadn't tackled, and I think they did a nice job with that. Thankfully, now that we have a fully approved vaccine, certainly as an employer, if you're going to mandate it, if you want to avoid one of the potential arguments, you might want to, lean towards a vaccine that actually has been fully approved. So I touched upon this earlier, and I want to hit in it in a little more detail now. You can mandate it with the exception of really two categories of individuals: those who have Americans with Disabilities Act protected medical condition, or those with whom have, under Title VII is the law, have a sincerely held religious belief for which the mandatory vaccine is an issue. Now, what I tell folks are, in general, you should, and I know a lot of folks don't like looking at job descriptions on a regular or ongoing basis, but I recommend that at least once a year you revisit job descriptions. Job descriptions are exciting stuff for folks like Ben and I who like geeky HR stuff. But the reality is, the reason why we focus so hard on those are because in the job description, you're supposed to list the essential functions of the position. Those essential functions, right, which almost always end with "and all other tasks as assigned." But those essential functions are the ones that help us when we get to folks who are making or who are requesting some sort of job modification. So what we say to folks are, one, you are obligated to engage any employee in the interactive process. So any employee for whom has come forward and said, I need an accommodation from the mandatory, or for any reason, any of your policy, I may need, or I think I need an accommodation because of my medical condition or because of my sincerely held religious belief. Under the law, the employer is obligated to enter into the interactive process, which means this is an ongoing back and forth dialogue. It's a dialogue whereby we're supposed to be communicating about what's the employee's reason for seeking this accommodation, and what's the sought after accommodation, and then the employer trying to determine is the reason for the accommodation valid, and then number two, is it something that we can do? Because as we get through this process, it is a very legal process, and there are states, California, New York, but just a good recommendation is to document that entire interactive process. So you should be, as part of that process, analyzing each of those essential job functions. You're supposed to be consulting with the employee and talking to them and finding out what it is that they're looking for, understanding the nature of their objection and or the requested accommodation. And then you're supposed to identify potential accommodations and then assess, if I provide that individual that accommodation, will they be able to perform the essential functions of the job? Because under the law, if you provide the accommodation, but they still can't perform the essential functions of the job, then you're not obligated to provide that accommodation. So what I've said to folks are, and I'm about to send some updated forms to the AAA, because as a result of working through my own forms that I created, I realized that they needed to have more information in them and more spots for taking and documenting things. So there is this, the employee's reasonable accommodation request form. Now, keep in mind, it may not come in the form of a form. It may be in an email. And if your supervisors are aware of someone who may have a medical condition or a protected religious objection, you are obligated to engage that person affirmatively. All right, but I suggest that you have a consistent process. When an employer does not follow a consistent process, you open the employer up to substantial and significant legal liability. Why? Because when there isn't a consistent process, the outcomes tend to be disparate. And if you recognize the term disparate treatment, disparate impact, those are discriminatory type related terms. And so what we want is a consistent process. Then there is a process, a HR reasonable accommodation process form for the HR professional. And this is the one that I've now actually split this form out, one into HR for medical and for process for medical and one for religion. And really what's in here are some of those instructions and guidelines tied around the process or the different considerations as you work through. So you should have those, you should have a form, you should make sure your supervisors are educated about what to look for, and then engage the HR professional. The process should be confidential. This is not something that you should be blabbing about in the world as to why someone might have an accommodation. For medical, you may request medical information from the healthcare provider. And I see the questions rolling in and we will get to them, I promise. So you may request information from the healthcare provider, and in that form, there is a spot to request information from the healthcare provider and an authorization from the employee. Now, you only should be seeking the information that's necessary to try and explain what the issue is, the reason for the accommodation, and then possibly what's the nature of that disability, what might meet that need, what might accommodation is it likely that the healthcare provider believes that this accommodation will allow that person to perform the essential functions of the job. You can provide a list of questions to the healthcare provider and can be reviewed by your own healthcare provider. What I suggest is you send a copy of the job description that's listed in the form to that healthcare provider so that they understand, because don't rely necessarily on your employee, because, for example, the employee might not have, just off the top of their head, more than likely, if you ask the average everyday EMT or paramedic, I lift people, I respond to emergencies, I have to carry stretchers, and that weight is anywhere from 200 to 300 pounds. And so what I would say is send a copy of the job description with, with some questions to that provider. Now, as it relates to a medical accommodation, the employer is obligated to provide the accommodation provided it's reasonable and does not create an undue hardship. Now, an undue hardship in the context of the Americans with Disabilities Act is one that doesn't involve great expense or great difficulty. So what is that? Well, that is really a case-by-case analysis by the employer to determine, is it great expense and does it involve great difficulty? So for example, if you had an employee who was a diabetic, let's say, and needed to carry their insulin with them, so they needed to carry a cooler, and if your organization had a policy that said you can't have anything in between the seats in the ambulance, I'd find that hard to believe. But if you did, if you do, you have to secure it. If the employee said, geez, I need to carry my insulin, it needs to remain at a certain temperature, can I carry it in a cooler that I will secure? That would probably be a reasonable accommodation. Now, if they said, I need you to install a mini fridge into every single ambulance, well, that probably wouldn't be. But again, it's a case-by-case basis. Now, as it relates to the religious objections, it has to be a sincerely held religious belief. And that religious belief, sincerely held religious belief, is interpreted very broadly by the courts, by the EEOC. Okay, and an employer is supposed to take that religious belief on its face. In other words, the sincerity of the belief on its face, unless there is some objective basis for questioning whether the nature of that belief and sincerity and or some practice. But just recognize, again, I think this is the area that it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and, one, people have changing religious or philosophical religious beliefs on all the time, but generally speaking, the courts have said, look, take them at their face unless there is something very obviously and objectively sort of contrary to their assertion. One of the things that I've said is there have been a lot of folks who have objected to the COVID vaccine based upon the fact that some of the vaccines used human fetal cells in the research and development. Now, there are a list of a whole bunch of vaccinations that used human fetal cells in their development. And what I would suggest is if, in fact, there were other vaccinations that, in fact, did use human fetal cells and this person's objecting, that might be the basis. But truthfully, I'm not sure that's the best or strongest way to go because, again, you find yourself in the job of trying to become a scientist or reading medical information, and what can happen? You can make mistakes. I, for one, have done that. So what I would suggest is this is one of those ones that unless you have some very, very clear objective information that says this person is not, does not have a sincerely held religious belief, then I would probably leave this leg of this alone. Now, what I will say is from what my research has shown is really that there are no major churches, major religions that really oppose vaccinations. I do know that the Pope and a whole bunch of the senior leadership in the Roman Catholic Church released a video essentially saying, look, we view this as charitable to those folks who cannot get it. And in different religions. But there are two. I think it's Ben. I think you listed one, right? Was it Lutheran, Wisconsin Lutheran, or something? Possibly.
That sounds correct.
Yeah. And I had the other one, but it's not coming to me right now. And for some reason, it did not come up in my notes. What I will say is, what I've said in that instance is, listen, ask the individual if they have consulted with their clergy, and you can ask for some documentation. Truthfully, again, this is one of those areas that I say it's not the strongest position to be questioning the legitimacy of someone's religious belief. The next leg of this is you have to provide it unless it creates an undue hardship. The undue hardship when it comes to a religion is a little bit different than it is when it's a medical condition protected under the ADA. When it comes to religion, basically, it's an undue hardship if it results in more than a de minimis expense to the employer. So a great example of what would likely be a reasonable accommodation would be, I can't work on Sundays because in my faith, it is a day of rest and we're forbidden from working. Can I just work the other 6 days of the week? That probably would be a reasonable a reasonable accommodation. Now, if in fact, though, it was, geez, I can't, in the instance of a vaccination, I can't transport to any one of our facilities, or I can't transport to 3/4 of our facilities. And now what I'm asking you to do is every time we have a patient that needs to go to that facility, I need you to dispatch out a second truck to to that call to then switch off with me so that this person can go to the facility where only vaccinated employees can go. I can't answer that for you, but my guess that would be operationally and logistically incredibly challenging. So it's not the same. ADA, it is an undue hardship, is great expense, great difficulty. Religion and undue hardship is more than a de minimis expense. All right, so what is a de minimis expense? Undue hardship, the employer must demonstrate that the accommodation will require more than de minimis costs. Those costs can be direct, they can be indirect. That can include lost efficiencies, infringes upon some other employees' job rights or benefits, infringes upon the customers or the patient's rights, impairs workplace safety, or causes coworkers to carry the accommodated employee's share of potentially hazardous or burdensome work. So that's a pretty broad definition that is directly from the EEOC's guide on religious accommodations. So just recognize, right, there may be, or possible accommodations may be if and when there is a vaccination, let's say, for example, that doesn't cause a medical condition for your employee or isn't offending their religious belief, could the employer then have to furnish that? That probably or likely would be a reasonable accommodation. Masking in the workplace, we've heard some places that have instituted mandatory vaccination programs have said those who have a medical or a religious objection have to mask 100% of the time and COVID test once or twice a week. That might be a reasonable accommodation. Of course, physical distancing and or potentially telework, although not really that possible for for EMS folks. So have that consistent process with those forms. And of course, same with somehow I managed to double my slides, Ben. I don't even know how in the world I did that. But so I just want to quickly, before we jump onto this slide, just want to touch some of the questions that are up in the Q&A. So the newest New York regulation from the governor removed the religious exemption. So we do not have to require anyone who claims a religious exemption to obtain the vaccine, ? I'm guessing the question is if the state of New York has said you don't have to honor religious objections, does an employer operating in the state of New York have to honor a religious exception? Keep in mind, there are state laws and then there are federal laws. And so recognize that the federal law, to the extent that the federal law will almost always trump the state law unless the state law provides greater protection. So I would want to look at this state law before I would definitively answer that question, because I believe your obligation under Title VII still exists regardless of what the governor in the state of New York has said, at least to go through the interactive process. Now, it may very well be that you might be able to prove more than a de minimis expense, but I would want to take a look at that New York state law prior to being able to give a real meaning. But just so we're clear, Title VII applies to every employer generally in the country. Does any actually? Why don't we touch on the next one? Then we'll hit all of our questions. So, Ben, how did Bell operationalize the accommodation process?
So we started back with our town hall, our virtual town hall, where we outlaid the mandated vaccine policy. And in that town hall and in the policy, we talk about how folks can either request an exemption either through a sincerely held religious belief or through the ADA and with the medical accommodations. And then from there, it kind of broke into two paths. But I can say this, and Scott, you already touched upon this, three most important words in human resources: documentation, documentation, documentation.
Mm-hmm.
So we're lucky enough to, we use DocuSign. So all of those forms that you saw Scott put up on the slide have been uploaded into our DocuSign. So whether an employee calls me, texts me, emails me saying, hey, I'd like to request an exemption, that is how we started, is through DocuSign. That way everything is time stamped, and we show when we sent the form, we show when we received the form, and then use the additional forms that Scott had talked about. So then it goes into two paths. I'll touch on the ADA one first. So if somebody requests an exemption through for medical reasons. We have an additional form that they get sent, which allows us to request that information from their doctor. And again, it's very specific to the vaccination. We're not fishing for any other kind of information. We want to know why this person has a medical reason to not take the vaccination. Even from there, it kind of goes into two paths again. One, we allow that exemption and we provide some sort of accommodation. We have a reasonable accommodation. Or in a case where maybe their doctor is just advising to defer the vaccination for a little bit as they're going through some treatment. So kind of two paths there. On the religious side, same thing. We send them a form through DocuSign, and they fill it out, outlining their religious beliefs and why they should be exempted from the vaccine. After that, Scott has been gracious enough to partner with me on these conversations that we have with the employees, and it's really designed to be that interactive process. And so we meet with that employee, typically virtually, because I'm not going to ask Scott to come all the way to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, unless he wants to visit. But we have those virtually, and it's really basically a means for that employee to articulate further on their sincerely held religious belief. And in some cases, we have one meeting and it's good enough. In other cases, we've had 2 and maybe 3 meetings because we are doing that. We're asking that employee to go back to their religious leader, their clergy, and answer some of the questions that may have been brought up during that meeting. Once we get through some of those, Scott already alluded to what the outcome there is. Then if it's more than a de minimis accommodation, then we don't have to allow it. And then at that point, that employee would have that choice on either taking the vaccination or not. But we're not quite there with some of our employees yet, so I don't have a good story for an outcome quite yet. I anticipate within the next week or so that Scott and I will wrap these up, and I'd be happy to follow up with anybody that has questions about that. But it's the main point. And I think the main takeaway, what we'd want most people to get is that some employees come into this thinking it's an argument or a battle, and it's not. At the end of the day, we want everybody to get vaccinated, but at the same time, we want to be respectful of their sincerely held religious beliefs. And that's what it is. It's an interactive process. It's a communication back and forth. It's not an argument. We're all on the same side. We all understand we have labor shortage in the EMS world. So we want this to be respectful on both sides.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. Because this is such a charged issue, I often find that people are ready to battle, and or when you question folks just as part of that process, the presumption is that it's in an antagonistic way, and that's really not what we're trying to do. The goal is to get to a place that works for both the employee and the employer. So keep in mind, right, that if an employer is responding to a long-term care facility or some other healthcare provider who has said, no, you have to be vaccinated, our goal, because no employer these days is looking to be with one fewer employee, that's for sure, is to get to a place of yes. And so part of that process is for the employee, and we've said this in a few of the meetings, if we can't, if we're unable to, let's say we can't give you you're unable to get vaccinated and we can't put you on an ambulance, what other proposal for an accommodation do you have? Which means, do you have something else you think you could do that would work within the confines of your religious or medical objection, but that also allows us to be able to use you as an employee? And sometimes that's viewed as, oh my God, are you telling me you're going to fire me? And again, that's not what we're saying to you. Is what the process requires is that you go through an interactive discussion. Hey, I can't do X. What else could, that's something I can't do. What else do you propose? And the employees oftentimes think, well, you're the one who has to come up with a solution. And I say, it's actually called an interactive process, where it's a dialogue between you and us to try and find a solution. And so again, I get why folks come at this ready to charge, but just recognize employers are not looking to try and fill more open spots or create new open spots, because we're just looking to, we're looking to fight you. This is not a political discussion. It's a discussion that we're no differently than we need to staff vehicles, and if you have a medical condition, we're going to try and we're going to do whatever we can to get to yes. It's what I sort of say is always getting to yes. But it does come across very antagonistic, and people say, well, you're forcing me. And I always say, employment in most states is not an indentured servitude. It's usually an at-will decision. And so if an employer has an obligation to do something, and as a result, they can't, for whatever reason, it's just unreasonable and they can't accommodate, that's not that the employer is trying to punish the employee. They're just trying to serve the underlying purpose. So I am going to start hitting some of those questions, but one thing I wanted to talk about real quick were vaccine incentives, carrots versus sticks. And what I will say is the EEOC has certainly given the green light for any vaccination incentives, or alternatively, there have been some folks who have had higher premiums for those who are not vaccinated, right? Because presumably there will likely be more medical expense related to those who are not vaccinated. What the EEOC has really said is, provided you can provide an incentive or arguably a surcharge to an employee, provided that surcharge or incentive is not so substantial that it's coercive, which I sort of smirk at, because the entire intent of an incentive is to coerce something to do something that they otherwise might not want to do. But what the current law is saying essentially, look, where you can you offer a differential? You sure can. And talking with Amanda just prior, as we were sitting in the green room, as you will, before we started the webinar, she was talking with a service down in Georgia who is offering incentives. And I want to say it was $250 to any full-time employee. And I think it was either $100 and $150 to any part-time employee who got vaccinated. Plus, if they had a breakthrough case of COVID, they provided that employee an additional 14 days of COVID-related paid time off in the event that they ended up having to quarantine or did have a breakthrough case. Would that be permissible? My gut is, based upon what I've heard and seen from the EEOC, yes, that would absolutely be permissible. So what we just say is that making sure, again, that any sort of incentive or wellness program would have to comply with ERISA as it relates to wellness, and of course, some of the other laws related to wellness. One of the interesting issues that have come up, and I got asked this question yesterday, was what about, fraudulent COVID vaccination cards? Apparently you can go out onto the web and buy yourself this card, and agreeably, it wouldn't exactly be the most difficult card to replicate. That being said, I did not do any research on what would be the penalty under, I'm sure there probably is a penalty under federal law for creating a forged CDC COVID vaccination record. I'm sure there is, but I'm guessing if you're one of those people that are downloading a fake COVID vaccination card and you're filling it out, that you're probably not terribly concerned about that. That being said, if an employee did produce a false or a forged COVID vaccination card, an employer would be 100% justified in terminating the employee, not for failing to be vaccinated, but for insubordination or for what would be a for-cause conduct related issue. So let's get to some of those attendee questions. So if you approve, from Mike, if you approve a religious accommodation, is the employer required to provide the accommodation? Can we just say, okay, come to work as normal? We already have a pandemic response guideline that requires masking, symptom checking, etc., that have been utilized for 18 months, or are we required to add another layer such as testing? So I think, Mike, what you're asking is, if we have an accommodation and as a result, we've said, okay, you don't have to get vaccinated, but you do need to mask, which it sounds like you are already doing, and you are going to need to test, right? And the question is, do we have to provide that testing? And so I will tell you that my good friend Steve Worth in his webinar last week said what I believe is the answer, which is yes, you absolutely do. Anytime an employer requires something of an employee, that, in order for them to work, generally speaking, they have to pay for that. But I will tell you, I would check with your own local council, because I did see plenty of documentation from many of the groups, including SHRM and others, and other law firms that do specialize in employment law, some of the larger ones, who have said, not necessarily. But what I would suggest is talk with your own local council. Certainly, just like there are differing laws here in Massachusetts, if an employee is required to wear a uniform, the employer has to pay for it. That was not always the case. Maybe 2 decades ago, the employee could be asked to pay for their own uniform. That's not the case anymore. And so, Mike, I hope I answered that question. If I didn't, just drop another one in there. How would a CMS mandate apply to an EMS agency that is attached to a CAH with a long-term care wing? Now, CAH, I'm sure, critical access hospital, but it also, by the way, means congenital adrenal hyperplasia. But critical access hospital with a long-term care facility wing. So I know Ben's like, seriously, Scott, we can't take you anywhere. So what I would say is, if CMS mandates, well, first of all, right now, just so we're clear, CMS, the Biden administration has told CMS that they need to issue regulations that will require all employees of long-term care facilities to be vaccinated. What we don't know is whether that will also include vendors, contract employees, which would then, servicing those long-term care facilities. The answer to this one is, until we see the regulations, I probably don't know. I can't answer that quite yet. But Corey, I think a great question. I'm hoping those regulations will be released sometime in the next week or two. Craig, we have a union CBA that requires them to hold an EMT or a paramedic license with the state as a condition of employment. I'm guessing what you're going to ask is, does that also mean that we have to necessarily, in other words, if we have a union, do we have to collectively bargain if we mandate vaccinations? Or more interestingly, if your state or county mandate vaccination? So I got this question from a member earlier this month, or actually early last week. Hey, LA County is requiring that all EMS personnel be vaccinated. Do we have to bargain that with the union? And I've talked with one. I did do some union stuff way back in the day, but I also conferred with some union labor experts that I know who said you absolutely must. What's called impact bargain. Basically, you're not bargaining whether the folks get vaccinated or not. What you are bargaining is how or what are the terms of that vaccination, and how, whether the employer will pay, what parts of that they'll pay for. How is that going to happen? Will you be paying for their time while they get vaccinated? Heather, if you require testing 1 to 2 times per week, who's responsible paying for the testing? I think sort of what I'd say again is check locally with your own council, because I have seen, while I believe your requirement is to pay for it as an employer, what I think is that, it will be, I would check with your state, because I have seen varying answers to this question from some pretty large law firms as well that do employment law. If they choose not to be vaccinated, who endures the cost of testing and PPE? Again, I believe this is one that sort of, I don't mean to say asked and answers, but I think very similar. I think you are required to pay or to provide that foot the cost for that testing. Can you share the forms? Absolutely. I will send out the updated forms that I just got in last night around midnight. I will give them to Meg at the completion of this so that she can share them for those folks who are AAA members and have the AAA handbook. Most of these forms have been in the handbook, but they are updated. I did update them just as a result of actually working with Ben on many of these. It's funny how you can be a consultant and use forms that used to work, and then when you start using them more often, as I said, I think I only did 4 to 5 religious exemptions prior to this pandemic. I found that, they needed more. So I've heard, Jason, I've heard of employers passing along the increased cost for health insurance to unvaccinated employees. Could you discuss this? Is there an improper incentive? I have also seen, and there is some guidance on, you can provide surcharged or varying health insurance costs for those who are unvaccinated. But what I would say, talk with your, certainly you can contact the AAA or talk with your own benefit specialist. Those brokers are really good at staying in touch with what the law is saying relative to incentives. You just need to make sure that it's not so substantial as to be coercive, which again, I think is asinine, but it just is what it is. If we have to pay for it, isn't that an undue cost? That is a great question. You would have to quantify that, because there are two ways you hit an undue cost. One is there's one incredibly big cost for one person, or because so many people have to be accommodated, now it's created an undue cost. Again, this is a case, the EEOC's handbook on this says a case by case analysis. So it is a great question that, as we, this is the reason why most people don't really care. This is one of the reasons most people don't care for lawyers, are because it really will depend in each specific instance. But Rich, if you want to reach out through the AAA info we can talk about that offline, and certainly anyone else can. I'm worried about losing staff that we don't have the luxury of losing. My question was more, do I as an employer have to add another layer, or can I as an employer approve the accommodation without requiring anything extra? We don't currently require testing or non-symptomatic employees. So the answer to that, Mike, is yes. If you want to just go ahead and approve that accommodation, you certainly can. I guess my question would be, why would you adopt a mandatory vaccination decision if in fact you were essentially just going to approve everyone? Well, then arguably you have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of adopting the mandatory vaccination? So here's what I'll tell you. Every employer, if they are able to accommodate essentially any employee who has a medical condition or a religious condition, they're able to do so without creating undue hardship, well, then guess what? You're obligated to do it regardless of what that is, if in fact it doesn't create an undue hardship. But that is, again, an organization by organization determination. Does any of this fall into ADA from an employee perspective? They could wear a mask similar to flu season, but I know the mandates do not seem to be flexible. I'm a chief in Rhode Island, and the mandate is effective for us October 1st. So, of course, it absolutely does fall into the ADA. One of the challenges would be is if you mandate vaccination, but you have an employee for whom they can't wear the mask. So now what's the solution? That probably falls into a serious evaluation of what's an undue hardship. So now you have an employee who's requesting no vaccination. The answer to that typically is masking and regular testing. And if it sounds like that's not an option because of this person's, let's say, maybe respiratory compromise, then you really are in what I would consider to be possibly an unwinnable position, and then you might not have to accommodate that. But Craig, certainly happy to talk offline on that. And I know we're over time, and Ben, I don't know if I think you had a hard stop at 3, but what I would say is that 2 your time, but I would say that I'm certainly happy to answer more of these questions. Our concern in Rhode Island is that DOH will suspend the license if not vaccinated by October 1st. That is interesting. We'll suspend your organizational license, in other words, the entity's ambulance license, if everyone's not vaccinated, or they will suspend the provider's license if everyone's not vaccinated. Craig, why don't you email me? I'm gonna just email me. I'm gonna type in my email so that we can talk offline that way. Actually, what I'm going to do is not be foolish and not only just type in, here's one way you can get us, and then alternatively, the other way, my email is right up there. You can email me and we can talk offline rather than hold everybody on that question. Who's deciding the validity of the religious exemption? Are you requiring a priest, pastor, etc. signature proof of doctrine? Truthfully, what the law says is you are relatively obligated to accept or believe essentially your employee's religious objection unless there is objective information that suggests otherwise. In other words, if you have, for example, a person of the Catholic faith, where we know that the Catholic Church has come out saying that it's considered an act of charity and that you should get vaccinated, that might be something where you would request documentation from their religious leader, because it's really contrary to what we're hearing the Roman Catholic Church is suggesting. So other than that, can you ask it? You can, but I would say tread lightly, because remember, it doesn't have to be an organized religion. So you may or may not be able to get that. And that doesn't mean that just because you weren't able to get it, that you're free from the obligation to go through that interactive process and try and find a reasonable accommodation. Does the mandatory vaccination have to apply to all personnel, or can it only be ambulance personnel and exempt the office personnel? Well, I think that's a good question. What I would suggest is whatever your requirement, that you be clear on exactly why you're doing it. So for example, if all of your office personnel are working remotely, and those folks are not in touch or interacting with the rest of your staff, they're all working remotely, could you just mandate those who are physically present in your building? I think you could. If you're, let's say your physical, this is kind of like the ETS, if your physical location is separate for your billing and none of your healthcare providers are coming in there, I guess you could. However, my one concern is that you could have a wave of COVID run through your billing office, and just like your personnel not being able to provide service or provide care, I'd be concerned about your administrative billing office not being able to actually recover the revenue for that, and it might wipe out your billing office for a period of time. So could you? Yes, you should just be very clear as to why you were making that decision. No, each licensed provider, Craig, you and I should definitely talk offline. Yes, if in fact they're requiring it of each licensed provider and they're going to, I'm interested in what the state of Rhode Island's plan is for those who do have religious objections or medical conditions. So let's see, I think I have one more. I think I've actually hit them all. Does this fall into ADA? Already answered that one as well. So that's all that I see in the Q&A. I cannot thank folks enough for those questions. Those are fabulous questions. And by the way, there will be more. And if you missed your question today, certainly you can always send that question into either, certainly my email or to info@ambulance.org. Ben, any closing thoughts or additional information? I didn't put Ben's email in because that poor guy should not have to deal with more than he's already dealing with.
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody here, and thank everybody for joining and listening to us drone on about mandatory vaccinations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. I know I sort of voluntold you. I said, like, wouldn't you like to do this with me? And you were like, sure, I'll do whatever helps the cause, which I really, really appreciate. Bell always steps up to the plate. So with that, I'll go back one. With that, I will pass it back to Meg to close us out. Thank you to all of you. Meg, if you want to give our closing information.
Of course. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone for joining us today. As we said at the top of the call, today's webinar was recorded. The recorded version will go out in tomorrow morning's Daily Digest. Before we hang up, if you want to access the PowerPoint, it's posted in the chat section down on your menu bar. And then if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to either us at the AAA or reach out directly to Scott, whose email is posted up here. And that's it for today. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.